When I signed up for the night shift as a security guard at an abandoned warehouse complex, I thought it would be an easy paycheck. I'd bring a book, sip coffee, and occasionally patrol the grounds. It was just an old storage facility on the outskirts of town. Quiet, isolated, and supposedly unremarkable. The first few nights were uneventful. The place was cold and drafty, with long, dark hallways and the occasional scurrying of rats to keep me company. My job was simple. Patrol twice an hour, check the cameras, and log any unusual activity. On the fourth night, things started to get strange. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something off on the security monitors. One of the cameras near the back of the warehouse, an area that should have been completely empty, flickered, showing what looked like a figure standing in the shadows. I leaned closer, adjusting the grainy feed. "Must be a glitch," I muttered. But something about the figure's shape, tall and motionless, unsettled me. I decided to check it out. Grabbing my flashlight, I headed toward the back of the complex, my boots echoing on the concrete floor. The air felt heavier as I approached the area, and my flashlight's beam barely seemed to cut through the darkness. When I reached the spot, there was nothing, no sign of anyone. Probably my imagination, I told myself, though my pulse was still racing. But as I turned to head back to the office, I heard it, a soft, scraping sound coming from deeper inside the building. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't an animal. It sounded deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Against my better judgment, I followed the noise, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I rounded a corner and froze. A rusted metal door, one I hadn't noticed before, stood ajar. Inside was a small room, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. And in the center of the room was a chair. The chair had thick ropes hanging off it, as if someone had been tied there and had struggled free. The floor was scuffed and scratched, and there was something else, a faint, dark stain trailing toward the door. My throat went dry. This wasn't in the building's blueprints. As I backed away, I heard the sound again, scraping, followed by a sharp metallic clang. This time it was coming from behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking, and saw movement at the end of the hallway. Someone or something darted out of sight. I bolted. Sprinting back to the security office, I locked the door and called the police, my words tumbling out in a panicked mess. They arrived 20 minutes later, finding me pale and trembling in the office. Together, we searched the entire building. The mysterious room was still there, but it was empty now. No chair, no stains, no sign anyone had been there. The officers told me the place had a history. Years ago, it had been rented out by a small company that went bankrupt. Rumors swirled about shady dealings, missing people, and illegal activities, but nothing was ever proven. I quit the job the next morning. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that warehouse with me that night. But I know one thing. I'll never take another night shift again. I took a security job at an old office building downtown. The pay wasn't great, but the hours fit my schedule. My main task was simple: patrol the building and ensure nothing out of the ordinary happened. The building had 10 floors, but only the first 4 were in use. The upper levels had been abandoned years ago after the company downsized. Management warned me that the elevators didn't go above the 4th floor and that the stairwell to the upper levels was locked, for safety reasons. It didn't bother me much. Most of my nights were uneventful, walking empty halls, watching cameras, and trying not to fall asleep at the desk. But that changed one night during a storm. It was around midnight, and I was watching the rain hammer against the glass windows in the lobby when the elevator chimed. Ding! I frowned. The elevator shouldn't be in use. I glanced at the security monitors. The feed from the elevator showed nothing, just an empty car. Confused, I walked over to check it out. The doors slid open, revealing exactly what I'd seen on the screen. Nothing. But then I noticed something. The elevator's display showed it had come from the 9th floor. That didn't make sense. The elevators couldn't go above 4. I stepped back and stared at the panel, trying to figure out what had just happened. Before I could process it, the lights in the lobby flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the elevator doors were still open, but now there was something on the floor, a single wet footprint. It wasn't mine. I took a shaky breath and decided to check the stairwell. Maybe someone had managed to get up to the upper floors somehow. My flashlight cut through the dark as I climbed the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. When I reached the 4th floor, I stopped. The stairwell door leading to the 5th floor, normally locked, was ajar. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking slightly. No answer. I pushed the door open and immediately a cold draft hit me. The 5th floor was freezing, the air thick with the smell of mildew and dust. My flashlight revealed cubicles covered in plastic sheeting, old office chairs and scattered papers. It looked like no one had been there in years, but then I saw movement. At the far end of the floor, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, something shifted. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. Still nothing. I crept closer, my heart pounding. As I rounded a corner, my flashlight illuminated a desk. On it was a phone, one of the old corded kinds, and the receiver was off the hook. Then the phone rang. The shrill sound nearly made me drop my flashlight. My hands shook as I stared at the phone, but I didn't dare pick it up. Suddenly, from behind me, there was a loud crash, a file cabinet toppling over. I whipped around, my flashlight darting over the room, but there was no one there. The air grew heavier, and I could feel a presence, like someone was watching me. That's when I heard it. A low, raspy whisper. "Get out!" That was enough for me. I ran, practically leaping down the stairs 2 at a time. When I reached the lobby, I slammed the stairwell door shut and locked it, my chest heaving. The rest of the night, I stayed glued to the security monitors. The elevator didn't move again, and the cameras showed no sign of anyone in the building. I quit the next day. Weeks later, I learned from a coworker that the upper floors had been abandoned after an employee went missing years ago. Rumor had it he'd been working late one night on the 9th floor and never clocked out. They never found him. Working as a night security guard at an old industrial warehouse sounded easy enough. The facility was massive. High ceilings, dusty concrete floors, and endless rows of shelves holding God knows what. I didn't ask too many questions about what was stored there, though. My job was to walk the perimeter, check the cameras, and lock the doors. Simple. But one night, I saw something I was never supposed to see. It was a Thursday, around 2 a.m. I had just finished a routine patrol and was settling back into the guard station when I noticed a van pull up to the loading dock on one of the camera feeds. That wasn't unusual. Delivery trucks occasionally stopped by at odd hours, but this one wasn't marked. No logos, no paperwork, nothing. 3 men got out, all dressed in black. They weren't workers, I could tell that much. Instead of heading to the main entrance to check in, they went straight to one of the side doors carrying duffel bags. This wasn't part of the schedule. I radioed my supervisor, but there was no response. Standard procedure dictated that I stay in the station and monitor the situation, but something about this felt wrong. I grabbed my flashlight, clipped my radio to my belt, and went to investigate. When I reached the side door, it was propped open with a crowbar. My stomach churned. I stepped inside, flashlight scanning the shadows. The air smelled strange, chemical, metallic. Then I heard voices. Low murmurs were coming from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. I followed the sound, keeping to the edges of the shelves. My boots barely made a sound on the concrete floor, but my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. When I rounded a corner, I saw them. The 3 men were standing in a cleared-out space near the back of the warehouse. They weren't alone. 2 other figures were kneeling on the ground, their heads covered with black hoods. Their hands were tied behind their backs, and I could see faint traces of blood on the floor beneath them. One of the men in black opened a duffel bag and pulled out what looked like rolls of duct tape and a long blade. I froze. My brain screamed at me to back away, to leave, to call the cops, but my feet were rooted to the spot. One of the kneeling figures whimpered, their voice muffled by the hood. "Quiet!" snapped one of the men. His voice was calm, almost bored, as if this was routine for him. I fumbled for my radio, but the static crackle gave me away. The nearest man's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto me. For a moment, neither of us moved. "Who's there?" he barked, pulling something from his waistband. A gun. Panic surged through me, and I bolted. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I sprinted back through the aisles, the flashlight bouncing in my hand. Behind me, I heard shouting, followed by the heavy thud of boots chasing me. I ducked down one of the rows, weaving through the maze of shelves. My chest burned, and every instinct screamed that I wouldn't make it out. Then I saw it, a small maintenance door at the far end of the warehouse. I flung it open and tumbled outside into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked near the main gate. As I peeled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The men were standing in the doorway, watching me. One of them raised his hand, almost like a wave. I didn't go back to that warehouse. I reported what I saw to the police and the company, but they brushed it off as a misunderstanding or trespassers. I quit the next day. A week later, I saw on the news that the warehouse had mysteriously burned to the ground. Arson was suspected, but no arrests were made. I still have nightmares about what I saw that night. I don't know who those men were or what they were doing. But one thing haunts me most. When I replay that moment in my head, I realize the man who spotted me wasn't surprised. He didn't panic or rush to stop me. He smiled. Working as a security guard at a suburban office park wasn't exciting, but it paid the bills. The buildings were mostly empty by 6 p.m., so my job was to lock up, do periodic patrols, and sit in the small security booth monitoring cameras. It was usually uneventful, almost boring. That night started like any other. I was on my third patrol, walking the perimeter of Building C, when I heard a loud metallic bang echo through the quiet night. It sounded like a door being slammed, and it immediately put me on edge. Nobody was supposed to be in the buildings after hours. I radioed my coworker in the booth, but there was no answer. Annoyed, I figured he was either asleep or out on a cigarette break. I continued walking toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I rounded the corner of the building, I saw it. The side door to the employee entrance was wide open, my gut twisted. The door was supposed to stay locked at all times. I stepped inside cautiously, my hand resting on the radio clipped to my vest. The hallway was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. No response. I was about to turn around and call the police when I heard it. A faint, rapid clicking sound like metal tapping against metal. It was coming from somewhere down the hall. My flashlight caught something on the floor, a single bullet casing glinting in the light. My blood ran cold. Before I could react, a shadow moved across the far end of the hallway. A man stepped into view, dressed in all black, his face obscured by a ski mask. He was holding a rifle. For a moment, we locked eyes. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here," I blurted, immediately regretting it. The man didn't say a word. Instead, he raised the rifle. I dove behind a corner just as the first shot rang out, the deafening crack reverberating through the hallway. My ears were ringing, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I scrambled to grab my radio, but it was useless, just static. My coworker was nowhere to be found, and I was alone. The shooter's footsteps echoed as he slowly approached, his boots crunching on the tiled floor. He was methodical, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. I crept along the wall, trying to stay out of sight. My only chance was to get outside and call for help. As I edged closer to the exit, I saw something that made me freeze. On the floor, just outside the security booth, was my coworker. He wasn't moving. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I reached the exit door and pushed it open as silently as I could. The cold night air hit my face, but I didn't stop to savor it. I bolted toward my car, parked at the edge of the lot. Just as I reached the vehicle, a shot rang out, and the side mirror exploded in a spray of glass. I ducked, fumbling with my keys. The shooter was outside now, his silhouette illuminated by the flickering parking lot lights. He didn't run. He just walked toward me, rifle in hand, like he knew I had nowhere to go. I finally got the door open, threw myself inside, and started the engine. Tires screeched as I sped out of the lot, the shooter's figure shrinking in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway across town, parked in a gas station lot, shaking uncontrollably. I called the police and reported everything, but by the time they arrived at the office park, the shooter was gone. They found my coworker, alive, but unconscious from a blow to the head. The bullet casing I'd seen inside was gone, and the side door had been locked as if nothing had happened. The company never followed up with me, and I didn't care. I quit the next day. To this day, I wonder why he let me go. He could have killed me easily, but he didn't. I still can't shake the feeling that it wasn't random, that I was just a witness to something I wasn't meant to understand. I was assigned to an overnight security shift at a corporate building that was more peculiar than most. The building housed several design and technology firms, and it had an odd layout. Lots of glass walls, reflective surfaces, and dim, cold lighting. The kind of place that always felt a little off, even when it was busy during the day. My job was simple: patrol the building, check doors, and monitor the cameras. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. On my first patrol, everything seemed normal until I reached the 8th floor. That's when I noticed a room I hadn't seen before. It was a small conference room with mirrored walls tucked into a corner of the floor. I'd been through the building during training and had never seen this room on any of the maps. Yet, there it was, gleaming mirrors on all sides, with a long, polished table and several chairs. What really caught my attention was the light. The room was brightly lit, but I couldn't see any light fixtures. It just seemed to glow. I hesitated, then walked closer. As I passed by, I noticed something strange in the mirrored wall. My reflection wasn't moving. I froze, staring at it. I moved my hand up to rub my face, and my reflection didn't follow. Instead, it stared at me, unblinking, its expression slowly twisting into something sinister, a wide, crooked smile that didn't belong on my face. I stumbled back, my heart racing. When I turned around to look behind me, the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was normal again, perfectly mimicking me. I told myself it was just a trick of the light or my tired brain playing games. I hurried back to the security booth and reviewed the camera feed for the 8th floor. But the strange thing? There was no room there. The camera showed a blank wall where the mirrored conference room should have been. I didn't go back up to the 8th floor for the rest of the night. A week later, I was working with another guard, Marcus. I mentioned the mirrored room to him, hoping for some reassurance that it wasn't just me. His face went pale. "You saw it too?" He told me he'd seen it once during his first shift. He hadn't entered, but he said he'd heard something. A faint whispering sound, like voices coming from behind the mirrors. He said the room was gone when he went back later, and he never spoke of it again. Curiosity got the better of me, and one night I decided to go back. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread, I returned to the 8th floor. The room was there again, glowing faintly. This time I stepped inside. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself was alive. The mirrored walls distorted my reflection just slightly, enough to make my stomach churn. As I moved farther in, I noticed smudges on the glass, handprints, dozens of them, pressed against the mirrors from the inside. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. The mirrored walls now surrounded me entirely. I banged on the glass, shouting for help, but the sound didn't echo. It was swallowed by the room. Then I saw them. Figures began to appear in the mirrors, their faces pale and expressionless. They pressed their hands to the glass, staring at me with lifeless eyes. One by one, they whispered my name. I closed my eyes, terrified, and when I opened them again, I was standing back in the hallway, my heart pounding. The mirrored room was gone, replaced by the blank wall I'd seen on the cameras. I quit the job the next day. Whatever that room was, whatever I saw in those mirrors, it wasn't something I ever wanted to see again. To this day, I can't look into a mirror for too long. Sometimes, when I do, I swear I see something move that isn't me. I worked as a security guard at a small medical research facility in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a high-profile job, mostly locked doors, empty hallways, and endless hours of monotony. But it paid well, and I was saving for school, so I didn't ask questions. The night shifts were the worst. The building had that sterile hospital feel, fluorescent lights, white walls, and the faint smell of antiseptic. There were only 2 guards per shift, and we rarely crossed paths during rounds. One night, my partner Dave called in sick. I wasn't thrilled about working alone, but the quiet meant fewer problems to deal with. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something strange on the monitors. One of the hallway cameras on the lower level was glitching, static, then blackness, then back to normal. This wasn't unusual. The building's equipment was outdated. But then I noticed movement. A figure crossed the hallway, just barely visible in the flickering footage. It was too quick to make out, but something about it unsettled me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down to the lower level. That floor was mostly labs, all locked after hours. When I got there, the hallway was empty, just like I expected. But something was off. The lights at the far end were flickering faintly, and the air smelled damp and metallic. I walked cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the dimness. I checked each door. Locked, locked, locked. Then I saw it. A shadow darted across the far wall, too large and too fast to be mine. My breath caught, but I kept moving. The source of the shadow seemed to be coming from Lab 3A, a room that was strictly off limits even during the day. The door was open. This wasn't possible. All restricted areas were supposed to remain sealed after hours, and only senior staff had access. I peered inside, my heart pounding. The lab was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of monitors displaying incomprehensible data. And then I saw her. A woman in a hospital gown sat on the floor, her back to me. Her head was tilted unnaturally to the side, and she was humming softly, a tuneless melody that made my skin crawl. "Ma'am, you're not supposed to be here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, and that's when I realized something horrifying. She wasn't sitting on the floor, she was hovering an inch above it. Her head snapped around to face me, but her body didn't move. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile that didn't seem to fit her face. The humming grew louder, echoing through the room even though her lips weren't moving. My flashlight flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, she seemed to move closer without actually moving. I turned and bolted, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. I didn't stop running until I reached the security office. When I checked the monitors, Lab 3A was sealed shut, just as it should have been. I filed a report but left out most of the details. I didn't want to sound insane. The supervisor brushed it off as a stress-related hallucination and told me to take a night off. But here's the part I can't explain. When I came back the next night, there was a new guard in my place. He didn't know me, but he said he'd been working there for a week already. I checked the schedule. My name wasn't on it. And when I called my boss to ask what was going on, he said, "What are you talking about? You quit last week." I don't know what happened in that lab or how I lost a week of my life, but I haven't worked security since. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that tuneless humming in the back of my mind. I used to work as a night security guard at an old corporate building downtown. The place was massive, 25 floors with a labyrinth of offices and empty conference rooms. My job was to patrol each level, check the cameras, and ensure no one wandered in after hours. It was usually dead quiet, the kind of silence that lets your imagination run wild. One night I was assigned a shift by myself. My coworker called in sick, leaving me to cover the entire building alone. I didn't mind at first. It meant fewer distractions. Things started to get strange during my second patrol. I was on the 10th floor, which was nothing but unused office spaces since the company downsized. I'd been through there a dozen times before, but tonight the air felt off, heavy, like I was being watched. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of me, dimly lit by overhead fluorescents. As I passed by a row of glass-walled offices, I caught something in my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement. I stopped and shined my flashlight inside. Nothing, just empty desks and chairs. But when I turned back to the hallway, it felt different. The exit sign at the end of the corridor wasn't there anymore. In its place was another set of offices, ones I didn't recognize. I frowned, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. I must have turned down a different hallway without realizing it. This building was easy to get turned around in, especially at night. I continued walking, looking for the stairwell to get back on track. But the farther I went, the stranger things became. The offices looked older, like they hadn't been used in decades. Dust covered the desks and the windows were streaked with grime. Then I noticed the sound. It was faint at first, like the low hum of a machine. But as I moved closer, it grew louder, more distinct. A rhythmic, mechanical thud, 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 like heavy gears turning. I rounded a corner, and that's when I saw it. The hallway ended abruptly, replaced by an open space that didn't belong in the building. It was a massive industrial room, with walls of exposed brick and rusted pipes. In the center was a giant, cylindrical machine that looked like something out of an old factory, and standing beside it was a man. He was facing away from me, wearing a suit that looked decades out of style. His posture was rigid, unmoving, like a mannequin. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. The man didn't respond. Slowly, he turned his head toward me and I froze. His face wasn't right. It was blank, like a doll's face with smooth, featureless skin where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The man didn't move, but the mechanical thudding grew louder, almost deafening. I turned and ran, not caring about protocol or checking my surroundings. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, but eventually I found the stairwell door. When I burst through it, I nearly collapsed. The stairwell was normal, plain concrete walls faintly lit by emergency lights. I bolted down the steps, skipping 2 at a time, until I reached the lobby. The building felt normal again. The air was lighter, the hum of the HVAC system steady and familiar. I sat in the guard station, trying to calm my racing heart. I checked the cameras for the 10th floor, hoping to confirm what I'd seen. But the feed was completely black. I quit the next day. I told my boss I didn't feel safe working there anymore, but I didn't explain why. I wasn't sure I could explain it if I tried. A few weeks later, I ran into an old coworker who'd been there for years. When I mentioned the 10th floor, his face went pale. "That floor?" he said quietly. "They stopped using it years ago after a worker disappeared. They searched the whole building and never found him." He paused, looking uneasy. "They say you can still hear the machines sometimes, though, like the factory that used to stand there before the building was built. I don't know what I saw that night, but I'll never step foot in that building again. Some things aren't meant to be understood."